Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mackenzie, for the warm introduction. Great to see everyone. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Hopefully, we can provide some insight and general knowledge to you about the EB-5 process. My name is Brandon Meyer. I'm the founder and principal of Meyer Law Group, an immigration law firm headquartered in San Francisco with additional offices in New York and San Diego, California. We have an all-star cast here tonight, as always. So I will give each of them the opportunity, 15, 20 seconds to introduce yourselves.
Well, thank you, Brandon. My name is Daniel Ryan, Managing Director, Atlantic American Partners. We're based in Tampa, Florida. We're a regional center. We're part of a 50-year-old investment banking firm that got into EB-5 about 13 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. My name is Kai Boyle. I am Vice President of Asia Markets for CMB Regional Centers. CMB is one of the oldest, most active, and by many accounts, one of the most successful regional centers in the EB-5 space. We were authorized as a regional center dating back to 1997, and my role with the company is Vice President of the Asia Markets for CMB. Good to be here with you tonight, and thanks for being a part of our evening. I hope we can bring some insights to what's happening in EB-5 and answer questions that you may have about the EB-5 program. Thank you.
We'll certainly do our best. Carl?
Thank you, everyone. My name is Carl Vandermova. I'm the Sales Director at EB-5 Marketplace. We're an online platform that provides due diligence on EB-5 investments, and we focus on projects that will likely result in a faster process.
Excellent. So I will get started here, moderator's prerogative. Let me just give everyone a brief overview of the recent changes in the EB-5 law. So effective March 15th of this year, after much drama and much controversy, we finally have a new EB-5 law that does many things, most of which, as we'll discuss, are to the direct benefit of investors and potential investors such as yourselves. So the highlights of this include an extension of the so-called regional center portion of EB-5 through September 30th, 2027. This is important because of the four types of EB-5, which I'll mention briefly. Usually 99% plus of people who go the EB-5 route go the regional center route for various reasons. So there's four types of EB-5: regional center, so-called direct, troubled business, and expansion of existing business. The latter two, most people don't do. They're too difficult. So pretty much 100% of people combined participate in either regional center or direct. So regional center extended through September 30th, 2027. Direct program, some rules change, but that's a permanent program without expiration. So getting to the highlights of the new law: minimum investment in targeted employment areas, high unemployment areas, rural areas, or infrastructure projects, $800,000, or $1,050,000 in projects that do not qualify for one of those four designations. I think the big game changer of a part of the new law is the ability of people who are in the U.S. So, for example, if you have children that are in the U.S. as students or on H-1Bs, the new law allows for people in the U.S. to effectively combine the first two steps of the overall three-step EB-5 process at the same time. This has major benefits to the investor and whoever's in the U.S. because not only does it allow them to basically start building their life in the U.S. significantly earlier than the previous process, it's designed to shrink the overall processing times as well. So I see this, it's known as concurrent filing. I see concurrent filing as a major game changer. Other important aspects is there was concern before under the old EB-5 law as to what happened to investors still in the system when the law is up for reauthorization. That problem has been effectively addressed. And so any investor who's in the system 1 year prior to the current expiration of the program can continue in the hopefully unlikely event that the regional center law is not extended beyond September 30th, 2027. And gentlemen, did I miss anything on the highlights of the investor stuff before I get to Carl to talk about some of the visa set-asides?
No, I think you did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. So, Carl, I took the very brief highlights of the change in the law. Now, there were some more technical changes to how visas were allocated, and also some technical changes to the so-called direct program. So, could you run through those for the audience?
Yeah, certainly, Brandon. So as far as the direct program is concerned, as Brandon mentioned, this is a permanent immigration program, so it didn't lapse as the regional center program briefly lapsed for 9 months or so. But it has changed in terms of the format. So there was a period from in the last 9 months or so that you were able to do something called a pooled direct, and effectively invest in a project as a direct investor with other investors. That's no longer available, but you can still do a direct investment as a single investor. So I think that being probably one of the most important distinctions between this direct and regional center. Direct, it has to be a single investor. It's designed partly for entrepreneurs wanting to establish their own business and hire 10 people, but you don't have to invest in your own business. You can invest as a passive investor into an existing business as a direct investor. The two main features of a direct investment relative to a regional center investment is that as a direct investor, it has to be an equity investment into the business. And the way jobs are counted is also different from the regional center model. The regional center has a more lenient way of counting jobs, and it includes direct jobs, but also indirect jobs, induced jobs as well. So it's based on a formula, and it generates a fairly high job count. For direct, it has to be full-time payroll employees in the company, so a little more stringent on that front. As far as so that program is available, the direct program. As far as the changes to the act that came into effect in March regarding visas or visa availability is concerned, there was quite a significant development as well, which also has some positive implications. In that, as was mentioned, I think briefly, about a third of the visas are set aside for investors in high unemployment targeted areas, in terms of high unemployment areas, infrastructure projects, and for rural areas. And why that's important is because it's essentially a sort of a new line that's been formed, and there is a potential of each country has a certain amount of visas that they're allocated, and if the demand exceeds that, then it potentially results in backlogs or retrogression, as it's referred to in the industry. And the important thing of the new visas that are set aside is it's a new queue that's being formed, so you're not going to be impacted by any potential retrogression if you invest in any of those categories. And in addition, one of the features that we do like to point out to investors is if you invest in a rural project, you're going to receive priority processing. Unclear what that means exactly, but our understanding is that it's going to be faster than normal processing. So it will result in a faster process, and to be determined exactly how much faster. But that's certainly one of the attractions of the new act as well. Is it's very beneficial to rural projects.
Now, Carl, one of the issues that we face in the industry is, we're from the U.S. Let's be clear about this. And so when we come to places, Vietnam, China, India, and we throw around the word rural, hey, invest in rural projects. The word rural has a completely different, meaning, characterization, image than it does to us necessarily in the U.S. Here in the U.S., if we make a little money, if we can't afford a beach property, we buy something in the mountains, in the countryside, in the rural. Whereas in our market, rural is a place you either never go or left and never go back to. So reassure the audience that when we're talking about rural in a U.S. context, that it doesn't mean extreme dire poverty.
Yeah, no, thank you, Brandon, for asking that question, because that's a common perception that rural means risky. Why would I want to invest in a risky project? But there are often companies that are in rural areas for commercial reasons, because that's where their market is, or that's because they have lower rent or lower labor costs. There are a lot of good commercial reasons for operating in rural areas. For example, it could be a recycling plant or a biofuel company, or even a ski resort or a high-end hotel, boutique hotel. They're all, good rural investment opportunities, and not necessarily, more or less risky simply because of their location. So I think yes, that it's obviously going to depend on the investment and the merits of the investment, but I think one should definitely not assume that rural is risky.
And so I failed to mention at the beginning that we will be taking questions, but we'll be doing written Q&A. So Mackenzie in the back, if you or your designee wish to walk around and collect questions as they come, just raise your hand, hold up a piece of paper, and those questions will be collected and brought to us. And so Kai, if in my opinion and Carl's opinion, the changes to the law were very, very favorable to investors, with some of the changes, concurrent filing, program stability, visa set-asides, etc. Tell us how, for regional center operators such as yourself, what impact does the new law have on how you do business?
Brandon, the law, the new EB-5 law, the Reform Act of 2022, brought forth and codified some additional stringent requirements for the regional centers. And those new requirements are those stopgap measures that actually will put in place protections for investors. And let me explain that. The regional centers now, the operators of a regional center and the key personnel have to do background checks, such as myself and our ownership, and those key personnel will have to undergo a background check, and we have to make some declarations to the USCIS that we are not bad actors, we haven't broken the law, we're not a convicted felon. We'll also have to provide a written document or a series of documents to show how we are going to comply with the new EB-5 requirements. What are those steps that we as a CMB regional center, and now all regional centers, what steps are being taken to ensure compliance with the requirements of the new EB-5 program? There's also requirements that to demonstrate how we're complying with the securities laws in the United States. All of those steps are meant to be in place to ensure that the investors are protected. Another example would be, Brandon, the fact that every regional center now has a requirement to either have a deposit control agent for the EB-5 funds or an annual audit of the regional center and the financial transactions for the regional center projects. So those are the steps that are now have been codified. They are in place to ensure that, as much as possible, that the regional centers are behaving in a way that's consistent with the requirement to protect investors and consistent with ensuring that the investor protections are in place.
Thank you, Kai. I just want to take a step back and define for the audience what a regional center is. One of the frustrations that audiences such as yourself have is when guys like us get up here and we just start throwing around these technical terms without defining them. So definitely sensitive to that issue as well. So effectively, what a regional center is, it's a group, a company that applies for what's effectively a non-exclusive license to develop EB-5 projects within a defined geographic area. So that's what a regional center is. The two gentlemen to my left, I forget how many regional centers you have amongst yourselves. You can certainly clarify it, but that's what a regional center is. It's a group that goes to the government and says, hey, we want to do this type of project, a hotel, and we want to do it in San Diego, California, and we want permission from you, the U.S. government, to allow people to invest in our project through EB-5 and get green cards out of it. So that's what a regional center is. And so Dan, so now that we know what a regional center is, and tell us about some of the other more technical changes to the law in terms of, job counting and target employment area and the real technical nuances of how the law has changed and what that means for regional centers such as yourself going forward.
Well, thank you. Before I answer that question, may I ask the audience how many out there are actually prospective interested investors in the EB-5 program? Can you raise your hands? So there's just a few. Okay, so I presume some of you are agents and interested other parties. So first of all, let me start by saying this reauthorization is good for the industry. It's good for you as a prospective investor. It's strengthened the program. The program for 30 years needed some adjustments, and there were some problems. So one of the areas that is helping is in the new calculation for job creation. And again, we're going through all the fine detail on the legalese, but the job creation will be refined, and those that do know how to create jobs properly are going to do well. Some of the, quote, bad actors that were forcing projects and barely meeting the 10 jobs per investor criteria, they will probably weed out. The other area that's probably, again, we're throwing out a lot of terms, and to those few investors that are out there, feel free to come talk to us because it is a little confusing. But the definition of TEA is an acronym for Targeted Employment Area. And essentially that's an area that's at 150% above the area unemployment rate. Now the goal is to try to invest money, create jobs in areas where there's a higher unemployment rate. In the past, there was a little bit of shenanigans, as we call it in the States. It's a little bit of maneuvering of parcel touching 100 meters to this parcel that touched 200 meters and a little meandering throughout different areas of the country.
Yeah, so Dan, there was a group out there that was telling me years ago how they, as a joke, but to prove the concept, obtained TEA designation for the United Nations building, the Westchester, New York Country Club, Radio City Music Hall, until the state of New York realized that that's what they were.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why this new legislation is welcomed. I mean, it's welcomed, let me put it this way, it's welcomed by the good players, and all the gentlemen up here are respectable players. You're going to see, as you do research, in the past there's hundreds of regional centers. Some are just average, basic real estate developer that just said, hey, I'm going to become a regional center. Sounds great. Well, they don't really know what they're doing. They had problems and either they're out of business or they soon will be out of business. So there is a whole new process to get reauthorized. We won't get into too much of that detail, but for you as investors and for you as Indian people interested in this EB-5 program, it couldn't be a better time to get involved in EB-5.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm going to, since I'm trying to make this as educational for the audience as possible, I just want to take a step back as well and just run through how the EB-5 process works for the individual investor. EB-5 is a 3-step process for the investor: one spouse and any and all children under the age of 21. I'm not going to talk about the form numbers and this and that. It's really irrelevant. Just talk about the high-level concepts of what each stage, 3 stages, is about. So the first stage, we only really care about 3 items to get you and your family through that first stage of the process. The first one is, did you invest in a project that qualifies as a compliant EB-5 project? Yes or no? Second one is, can you prove the source of your $800,000 to make the investment comes from legal sources? It's known as source of funds. Yes or no? Source of funds is about two things primarily at its basic level. The credibility of the story of how you earned that $800,000 and the ability to document it. That's it. That's it. We can talk about all these technical nuances, but does it make sense and can you back it up with paper? If the answer is yes, your source of funds is good. Third element that we need to prove at the first stage of the EB-5 process is basically show what's known as path of funds. To document how the money came from you as a principal investor to the project. And that's basically done in most instances by providing paperwork. So if you invest in a compliant EB-5 project, your source of funds, which I should mention that we're only worried about the $800,000 used to make the investment. So if we don't have to prove the legality of your entire net worth, which is quite helpful in this. So good source of funds, good project, good path of funds. You should be approved in the first stage of the EB-5 process. No problem. Approval rates are historically, well, at least over the last 8 to 10 years, in excess of 90%. Second stage of the process is where you actually apply for the temporary 2-year green card. Probably the easiest step in the process. So as long as you're not a criminal, not a member of terrorist organizations, as long as you don't have significant prior immigration violations, and if you do, even let your attorney know ahead of time. Don't call him or her up the day of the interview and say, "Oh yeah, I forgot about those 5 arrests I had 10 years ago. Is this a problem?" Do it at the beginning. So as long as you're not a criminal, terrorist, or have U.S. immigration violations, pretty much the second stage of the process is the easiest one. Third and final stage is more on the project, and that's where the project has to document that they took your investment funds and created the necessary 10 jobs. Project can show that, and if the project can show that they did not refund any portion of your investment funds early, 829, the third stage of the process should be approved as well, resulting in a permanent green card. Now, Carl, I know that I didn't prep you for this, but I'm going to ask you because I've been talking for too long. So everyone is concerned, justifiably so, about how long these 3 steps will take. And yes, the ability to do this in the U.S. and combine the first 2 steps should help shrink some of this time, but can you briefly talk about how the new law address the issue of processing times going forward?
Yeah, there's a recognition that processing times are long, and it needs to be addressed. So I think that's a good start. And in the Act, there was actually specific provision made to address this, and I believe it involves basically an initial sort of investigation into how to improve processing times. And ultimately, I think it will, that USCIS is going to probably increase their fees sufficiently to staff up and address processing times and bring those down to certain guidelines that they've set for processing. So that is definitely something that they're striving to do, and we're all hopeful that they do that, because frankly, that's the biggest concern that I hear from most investors is processing times take too long. But there are fortunately ways you can sort of speed that up. And as I mentioned earlier, one of those would be to invest in a rural project. The law basically said that rural projects are going to receive priority processing. It isn't quite clear what that means, but we did a straw poll amongst some immigration attorneys, and that they felt that it could probably result in an approval within a year. That would be wonderful. And then there's another category called expedited processing, and that is if you invest in a project that's in the national interest. So that those are few and far between, but that we do know what that means, and that essentially means that you get moved to the front of the queue and could get approved quite quickly. So though there are some ways to speed things up if timing is of a priority. But as Brandon mentioned, I think a lot of that can be addressed through concurrent filing. If you are in the US, you can essentially now get the lion's share of the green card benefits very early on without having to wait for the I-5 to 6 approval.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very important, this ability to do concurrent filing, because one of the stressful issues that parents face is if their child is getting close to the age of 21, and because once you reach the 21 with some exceptions, the child is too old to complete the process. But if they can get the second stage filed in the US, then the age out issue becomes entirely irrelevant to them. And also, too, we see this for those that are F1 students who've completed their student time in the US and can't get an H-1B visa because the H-1B numbers are too low, or demand outstrips supply for new H-1Bs by a factor of 5 to 1. EB-5 eliminates this stress for those who are students in the US. You start the process for your child early in their university days, then they should have their green card by the time they hit the job market. It gives them a massive advantage over their F1 student peers who are stressed about whether or not they'll be selected in the lottery, taking jobs with companies they don't work for purely because the company's willing to sponsor them for an H-1B. And then, we just had the H-1B lottery at the end of March. This is the time of year where we're receiving lots of calls from people that say, hey, I didn't get selected in the lottery. I have to leave the U.S. by mid-July. What do I do? And at that point, EB-5 is the only option for most people. So I think I kind of gave the answer away, Kyle, before I asked the question, which is, one of the criticisms that we hear from, or as a project operator, you hear and Dan hears as well, is why would I want to invest in this EB-5 thing? You're only offering me a half a point a year. I want to make real money off this EB-5 thing. So can you offer me a higher return? So can you tell the audience maybe why that's not necessarily the best way to look at EB-5?
And I'm chuckling because I'm seeing some people nod right now. So it is a question that comes up. Before I address that, for the folks that are prospective investors, there's a couple of things. It's easy for us to we talk about so many things. We want to make sure, it was on the video, but we want to make sure you understand this is a returnable investment. It's not a fee. Okay, that's important. A lot of times we start talking and the next thing you know, we forget to talk about the basics. The other thing is, when you start looking at so-called projects, because you're going to see projects all over the place here. Projects are projects, that's good. And you want to know about the projects, but really what's most important is the sponsors behind the projects, the folks that are actually going to build this project. And in many cases, some of the sponsors are these so-called bad actors that will be weeded out. So when we talk about projects, please stop and say, I want to know about the sponsor group. And that is very, very critical. And then the third thing is, at the end of the day, these projects, which are really driven by a good sponsor, you want to make sure that they create a lot of jobs. Because ultimately, this is a job creation program. And the minimum is 10 jobs per investor. Our company, on average, over 35 projects have created 20 jobs per investor. So these are critical, basic things that I think we need to just take a minute to address.
Yeah, so Kai, would it be fair to say that, for potential investors who are evaluating projects, that if someone offers something that's a return that's significantly higher than what kind of the median of the market is, that may be a cause for concern?
It may be a red flag, and we have to examine, once again, that risk-reward equation and that ratio. Typically, when there is a higher rate of risk, there is a required higher rate of reward, or a payment or a pledge of higher interest to attract those investors who would not wish to undertake any risk at all for their immigration pursuits. EB-5 is that way. Investors that want to do EB-5 want to know that when they invest with a regional center, when they are moving forward, that they can plan on achieving what their goals are, and that's to get a permanent green card. And then at some point in the future, there's the hope of the return of that investment capital. Very few people that I've ever spoken to, and in fact, I have spoke to hundreds, if not thousands over the years, have ever said to me, no, I don't really care about that stuff. Just give me a high rate of return. What the goals are for the EB-5 investors to get that permanent green card. Focus your mind, and for the investors, focus on the fact that the green card is the return. Any financial return that is a result or a return on the investment is modest, and that's by design. The projects that we put forth, that we underwrite, and that we offer in the marketplace for EB-5 investors pledge a very modest return on the investment capital or distribution of annual profits. It's modest, but the goal is to achieve the permanent green card. And to this date, we've been able to deliver that without fail. Every investor that files an I-829 in a CMB project does so knowing that sufficient jobs have been created for the approval of that petition.
Yeah, so I guess to summarize, the kind of outcome matrix from best to worst in terms of EB-5, absolute best outcome, return of the 800,000, full green card approval, and some return above that. The worst outcome, obviously, is return of less than 800,000 and no green card. But the second worst, in my opinion, would be 800,000 back, return of investment above the 800,000 and no green card. That's a complete waste of time. So that's the way of saying the main ROI is the U.S. permanent residence. I'm sure if there's people with quantitative experts out there who could calculate the value of the green card. Actually, Mackenzie, I think that should be Lee's next job, is to quantify the value of U.S. permanent residence for various people. So give that assignment to him as well. We have about 10 minutes left. How are we doing for questions back there, Mackenzie? Okay. So Kai, sorry, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to concur. I completely agree with Brandon. The reason you're doing EB-5 is to come to America, live, educate your kids, green cards. You're not doing it for the best real estate investment in the world. And you're going to find a lot of players out there. They're going to try to attract you with, we'll pay you 3%, we'll pay you 2.5%, we'll pay you 4%. You're not doing it for a return on investment. You're doing it to get yourselves and your families to America, get your money back, get your green cards. Look at it as you're putting the money in a bank account with a safe haven. At the end of the day, you come to America, you live a good life, you get your money back. So don't spend a lot of time shopping around and seeing all these different, quote, projects that are paying big returns, because at the end of the day, the green card is, as Brandon said, your return on investment.
Well, Dan, what I used to tell people was if you wanted to make a lot of money, high return, invest in Apple stock. But I can't even say that anymore now that it's down 25%.
That's true. So the point is, be very careful.
And to the point that the goal is to achieve the green card for yourself and your family members, and then at some point to see that investment capital return. We've started an entirely new platform, non-immigration based, for that high rate of return, a pledge of that. But it's separate. It's completely separate from the immigration side on the EB-5. This portion, the NHK portion, it separates that, and it delineates the fact that there is a purpose for the EB-5 investment. That's to create jobs and for the American economy, and number two, to get a green card for the investors.
Stick with you, Kai. I think you briefly mentioned about how the regional centers, now that we've defined what they are, as part of the new law, they're supposed to recertify. Like, what is that about? Can you just run through that for a couple minutes for us?
Sure. The USCIS interpreted the new statute as requiring the regional centers to, number one, the existing regional centers that were in existence at the time of the statute being adopted, they were to no longer be a valid entity as for the purposes of an EB-5 in the EB-5 program. They interpreted that anyone that wanted to be a regional center had to be reestablished and to go through the process of filing a new form, a newly created form, and that would request that the USCIS provide the benefit to the applicant of establishing a regional center. And the regional center, when you hear the word region, it is meant to be a term that applies to a geographic scope, a specific geographic area. And the law says a limited geographic area. So the regional centers, or those who wish to become a regional center, had to fill out this new form, identify the geographic area in which they wish to operate, how much money they intended to invest or they could pool for investments, and the jobs that would be created and what the process for job creation. So it was this long, extensive form that was required. And that's based upon the interpretation by the USCIS. However, in the real world, there are those that have a different interpretation of the law and that differing opinion of how the law should be applied to existing regional centers. Now, that interpretation included the fact that, hey, wait a minute, the Congress's intent was to move the program forward. It had lapsed for a period of time, and now this was not a rebirth or a reestablishment, but it was a revival of the existing program with some concepts that were no longer, or that were not there, that needed to be implanted into the program to protect investors and to revitalize the program, as it were. It wasn't meant to scrap everything and to start new. So there have been lawsuits that have been filed on, each coast is filed, and it's working its way to the middle. And I know that IIUSA has participated in that. Some regional centers have participated in filing lawsuits because they challenge the interpretation of the USCIS, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, that eliminated regional centers. And so we'd like to get back to business as soon as possible, but now we've got this process where we've got to follow the USCIS precept, but there's challenges to that in the courts.
So, Carl, I'm a potential investor sitting in the audience again, and I'm listening to Kai and thinking, gosh, it's this EB-5 industry again, just same old stuff in here for a couple of years now. Can't get their act together. I can't quite file yet, so I'll just wait until all this drama gets resolved. Can you explain to me why me waiting may not to start the process may not be the best approach?
Yes, certainly. First of all, I'm quite hopeful that it will be resolved quite soon. I think the quickest way for USCIS to sort of disarm these two lawsuits that are challenging the fact that all regional centers now have to get redesignated is to actually approve regional centers. And so I think that is my expectation, that this won't last much longer, and we'll start seeing regional centers get redesignated very soon. But to your point, Brandon, I think if you're going to go down this route, it does take a little time to get your application ready, to start working on your source of funds, working with your immigration attorney. That does take a couple of weeks. And ideally, you'd want to be in a position to move quite quickly, because once regional centers are redesignated and the program reopens, you'd ideally want to be one of the first investors in, because in particular, I think, because as I mentioned earlier, about a third of the visas are going to be set aside for investors in high unemployment areas, in rural areas, and in infrastructure projects. And if you're investing in any of those projects, you really do want to grab one of those visas. And so if you're in a position to move quickly, you'll be one of the first investors to file. You guaranteed a visa. And so I think there's a big benefit to being able to move quickly, and that would mean starting the process now.
Well, yeah, absolutely, Carl. And I think, like the Rolling Stones once saying, time waits for no one. So I always see this thing where that's just like, oh, I like Dan's project, I like Kai's project, but I'm just going to wait. And then, other people didn't wait and jump in line and subscribe to you. to subscribe to that particular project before you do. So what does that mean? That means you have to start your due diligence all over again. So you're always, as the saying goes, a day late and a dollar short by waiting. I like to say too that waiting never made anything go faster, and that is certainly true in the EB-5 context. So I think we have 5 minutes left. Any questions? Any written questions that were submitted out there? No. Okay. Oh, all right. We got a couple. Good. So while those are being collected, go for it, Dan. It's all
sure.
you.
While we're waiting, and I think Brandon, everyone up here is on the same page. While you're doing due diligence and thinking about whether or not this is right for you, you can be active. You can start organizing your financial documentation. It's called source of funds. It does take a while. So, you're going to be looking at different sponsors, regional center, projects, waiting for all these things to kind of settle. You can do your own work right now on getting your financial statements in order, because you will have to document how you obtained the money, where it came from, and have a paper trail. So if you wait, just like these gentlemen say, it could take another 60 days. But if you start doing that now, it'll help in the process. The other thing I will mention, and this is a little plug for the attorneys out there, including Brandon, the best thing to do, and I know he's going to, there's a little lunch involved in this probably sometime down the road, but it's really important to start talking to immigration attorneys. They're going to answer a lot of these questions that regional centers, we're not lawyers. They are. A lot of the questions you're going to have are legal related that you really should start and interview these folks. Generally, we tell all of our clients, talk to at least 3. Review, talk to them, sit down with them, and find out what their track record is, and it gets you a process to get going.